Did you know that today is World Suicide Prevention Day? I bet many of the audience didn't, and that exposes a real problem that we're facing in the West, a suicide crisis in the West that I believe, like Dr. Bohr did, is exacerbated tremendously by this whole euthanasia-assisted suicide movement. I would also like to thank you for having me, and I point out also that people who are right to life are certainly not the only opponents of legalizing assisted suicide or euthanasia. I had the great honor of interviewing Dame Cecily Saunders for my book, the first version of my book. I went out to St. Christopher's twice. I met Dr. Sykes. And Dame Cecily, what a wonderful woman. And she told me in unequivocal terms that her hospice movement that she created, she's one of the great medical humanitarians of the 20th century, that her hospice movement was dead set against assisted suicide because it, as I recall her telling me, it denies the intrinsic equal dignity of my patients. And she also pointed out that when you push assisted suicide, it is done through fear-mongering. That is, fear-mongering on the difficulties of death, which the hospice movement has shown can almost always be significantly alleviated. I would also point out that one of the great UK campaigners against legalizing assisted suicide is Lady Jane Campbell. I believe she started the group Not Dead Yet UK. And I had the great honor of meeting her as well when I was over on a speaking tour against assisted suicide back when the Jaffe bill was going through the House of Lords. And so you'll find that the people who oppose assisted suicide euthanasia are very diverse. They're religious and they're secular. They're pro-life and they're not pro-life on the issue of abortion. They're people with disabilities. They're civil rights campaigners who often will point out, particularly in my country, that people who have difficulty getting access to quality medical care would never have difficulty getting access to assisted suicide or euthanasia. I also think we have to understand the lexicon. When euphemisms are used, such as, quote, aid in dying or, quote, death with dignity, the idea is to deflect people away from the brutality of what we're talking about. We're talking about, in assisted suicide, a doctor validating somebody's suicide as a means of ending suffering, and then providing the lethal prescription to do that, or in the case of active euthanasia, actually committing homicide, even though it's legal, the idea of the lethal injection or the lethal jab. So this is of great concern to me. And I really feel as if, as I said when I started my discussion, this is World Suicide Prevention Day. But you don't hear as much about suicide prevention anymore as you do supporting euthanasia and assisted suicide. All of the energy that I see in the media, and certainly in popular culture, television shows, movies, are towards the idea of normalizing ending your own life as the, quote, death with dignity. And that made me think, when my father died in hospice of cancer, was that not a dignified death? When my mother died in my home at age 99 of the effects of Alzheimer's disease, dementia, did she not have a dignified death surrounded by her loved ones? I reject that idea. And I think we have to think about, as Dr. Bohr talked about, what is the impact of legalizing killing, because that's what we're talking about. We have to be blunt. We cannot hide behind euphemisms. We have to describe things not in a provocative way, but in an accurate way, in a descriptive way. When we're talking about ending life, that's what killing is. Because of human suffering, there's no way, as the doctor put it, you can limit it to the terminally ill, because there are people, and he mentioned the mentally ill, who suffer for a far longer period of time and perhaps far more severely than the terminally ill. And once you say, well, the terminally ill can have this, why not them? And there really is no logical answer to that. In fact, you'll see in Canada, in Belgium, and in Netherlands, and in my country, in the states that have legalized it, like Oregon and California, as soon as it becomes legal and the normalization process goes forward, you start seeing stories in the media talking about the protective guidelines that were supposed to be protective are now described as obstacles to getting what you want or dying your own way. And it becomes a very serious situation, a very serious problem. People do not commit assisted suicide because of pain, very rarely, because as the doctor said, pain can be controlled. They do it for existential reasons. They worry about being unable to engage in enjoyable activities. They worry and are sometimes terrified about losing dignity. They fear being burdens to their families and their loved ones. In fact, there was a recent statistic out of Canada on the nation's euthanasia law that over 50% said that one of the reasons they wanted the lethal jab was because they were going to be burdens, meaning they put themselves out of their loved one's misery. This is a very, very serious circumstance. And I also want to take the media to task, because whenever there's a assisted suicide, perhaps somebody goes to Switzerland for one of the suicide clinic deaths, maybe from the UK, you see story after story saying, well, they died their own way, even though sometimes we've seen joint geriatric assisted suicides of elderly couples dying. You never hear about how in the Netherlands and Belgium, I'm sorry, I hope you can't hear that siren going by my home, but how they've now conjoined euthanasia with organ harvesting. In the Belgium, I remember reading one study out that was published in a medical transplant, organ transplant professional journal, that one of the people who was euthanized was mentally ill with self-harming. And so the, quote, treatment for self-harming was the ultimate harm, being killed. And then 5 minutes later, the body of that person was in a surgical suite and their organs were being procured. Now, I can't think of anything more cruel than letting somebody who's having a terrible, awful time getting through the night because of existential anguish feel that their deaths have a greater value than their lives. But that's what you're beginning to see. And in Canada, when somebody qualifies for euthanasia in Ontario and Quebec, the euthanasia authorities get in touch with the organ donation organizations so that the organ donation organizations contact the patient who wants to die asking for their organs. This is a terrible objectification, if you will, of turning people who are not receiving suicide prevention, I would note, that telling them that, boy, we can really have some value from your death. So if somebody, let's say, is a veteran who's been in Afghanistan and has PTSD and becomes suicidal, we engage suicide prevention as we should. When you find a teenager who is in anxiety, perhaps because of the isolation, because of the COVID crisis, we find suicide prevention as we should. But if somebody says, oh, but I have cancer, suddenly suicide prevention is not engaged, even though that should be and is part of, as hospice was originally created. Dame Cecily told me suicide prevention was a key part of what she intended when she created that system. And I've been a hospice volunteer and I've seen it in action. And I want to describe a case that I had that's a real story, and it kind of highlights something I think that is important. This was my first patient I was asked to go visit. And I would visit people who were in hospice once a week. And the fellow's name was Ernie, and he was an old Italian-American gentleman. And he was with his son and his daughter-in-law in the house that he had lived in for decades. And as soon as they introduced me, I went into his room, and the door closed. He fell into my arms. And he was crying. I mean, tears were coming out of his eyes. I want to die, I want to die, I want to die. I said, Ernie, why do you want to die? I'm a burden. I'm a burden. I said, Ernie, you're not a burden. Your son's taking care of you. He loves you. Your daughter. I'm a burden. I'm a burden. Well, I would come once a week. And over time, Ernie's mental state began to improve. People were coming over to the house, I remember, with cookies and casseroles, you know, that whole kind of thing. And there was one fellow who must have been a close friend of Ernie's, because every time I was there, and I was sometimes there on different days of the week, he would visit. And I would leave the two elderly gentlemen alone and Ernie had congestive heart failure, which is why he was in hospice. And so they could talk, but this fellow had a very strong voice, and then I could hear him in the other room, and he'd say, "Ernie, you gotta fight, Ernie, you gotta fight." Well, one day I finally lost Ernie. He didn't die. He got better, and he got kicked out of hospice. And he told me, he played the last day I was visiting with him. He was playing, gave me a mandolin solo, and he looked at me and he said, "Wesley, you know my friend Joe," which was the fellow who I mentioned. "You stay away from Joe, Wesley." And I said, "Why, Ernie?" And he said, "He's an undertaker." You can't make something like that up. But let me tell you, if assisted suicide had been legal, and this was it took several months for Ernie to get out of that darkness. If assisted suicide had been legal at that time in California, which is where I was living at the time, as it is now in California, Ernie would have asked for the pills. And because he would have qualified as 6 months left to live, which is what the hospice requirement is, even though as we now see it is sometimes mistaken, he would have been able to receive it. And I'm telling you, he would have taken those pills. He was in that much despair. So when we legalize assisted suicide, when we legalize euthanasia, we not only open the door to the idea that these are expendable people or a killable caste, C-A-S-T-E, but we abandon them. Because people who want to die because they have cancer or because they have a significant disability or because they have motor neuron disease and so forth are just as entitled to suicide prevention, and their lives have just as much equal moral worth as anyone else's. But what we're saying now is, well, we don't oppose all suicides, we only oppose some suicides. And that can lead to a terrible abandonment, and as the doctor said, people beginning to think, well, this is what I should do, not only for me, but for my family and for my society. There's a lot more I could say. The situation in the Netherlands is even worse than the doctor described. There's infanticide in the Netherlands under what's called the Groningen Protocol. In Canada now, it looks like they're going to expand euthanasia to people with dementia if they ask to die ahead of time. And in terms of doctors not wanting to commit euthanasia or assisted suicide, what sometimes happens is if a doctor says no, then the patient will just go to another doctor. They'll go doctor shopping. And in fact, there are some doctors who've opened death practices in California. That's happened. In the Netherlands, there's a particular clinic that makes house calls where if the patient's own doctor says no to euthanasia, they will go and they will make sure that the patient dies. So I'll stop here because I'm a lawyer and short-winded is not my strong suit. And I'll be happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Wesley, for that really, I think, stark exposition of why we have to here ensure that we protect and enhance our hospice movement that we're so proud of, and it is, I think, one of the world leading hospice movements. Very concerning to hear you say it's easier in some jurisdictions to get funding for assisted suicide than for hospice care. Thank you for that. We have some questions. I'll relay two of them if I may. Firstly, and this is from Ronan Mullen, who's one of my colleague elected representatives over in Ireland, Northern Ireland. Thanks for the excellent presentation. What can be said about the ability of doctors now to prevent, control, or manage pain described as unbearable? So that's Ronan's question. Can I give you the second question that, if I may, whilst you're thinking about that one, Wesley? This one's from Mark Pickering, who leads the Christian Medical Fellowship in the UK, and he says this: we've heard much said in the UK about how assisted dying is not suicide because people with terminal illnesses are not suicidal. This strikes me as a confusion of language. Do you have any thoughts on that? And that's from Dr. Mark Pickering.
Yes. In terms of the issue of pain, pain is used to scare people into supporting assisted suicide, but as we've already discussed, it's not the reason why people actually commit assisted suicide, because palliative care, pain control, has really made it to the point where even if you have to do what's known as palliative sedation, which is very rare, it's needed in very few percentage of the cases. And that's not the same thing as terminal sedation, and I can describe the difference if you'd like. But people can be kept out of that kind of intense suffering with regard to pain, with regard to the idea of feeling breathless, and so forth. Palliative sedation is something that is a legitimate palliative technique where people are put into various levels of perhaps semi-consciousness or relaxation or even unconsciousness, but it's titrated. People do not remain in those conditions indefinitely. They can be brought up and down, and it's a very careful procedure. And when people die in palliative care, it's generally from the underlying disease. It's not from being sedated. And in fact, this is another important point. A lot of people say, well, because pain control can sometimes lead to a death earlier than would otherwise be the case. That's an unintended side effect of pain control that can, of course, happen. But you would no more say that that's assisted suicide than you would say if somebody died on the surgical table having heart surgery, that was euthanasia. Sometimes an unintended side effect occurs. But I have an oncologist friend who's also a board-certified pain control specialist. He and I co-authored a book called Power Over Pain, and he said actually that good pain control extends life, because when people are not expending that tremendous energy that goes into experiencing pain, they actually can live longer. So good quality palliative interventions can actually extend life, and that also values the patient. And of course, I support giving whatever palliation is required, even if that might have an unintended side effect of causing somebody to die earlier than they might otherwise have. That's treating the patient as a person. Terminal sedation is when somebody's not actually actively dying and they are suffering, or maybe they're not even irretrievable or irremediably suffering. They're put into a coma, an artificial coma, and then allowed to dehydrate to death without food and water, a process that takes 2 weeks. That's a form of slow motion euthanasia, and they do that quite a bit in the Netherlands now, that many doctors don't like committing euthanasia because they have to be present when the patient dies, when they give them the lethal injection. And you're seeing an increased number of terminal sedation situations now. In terms of, it's not really suicide if you're terminally ill, but it is suicide if you're not terminally ill. That's just utter nonsense. And it's playing a word engineering game to try to get people to swallow the hemlock. Suicide is defined as an act that takes your own life. When you take an overdose of pills, whatever the reason might be, whether it's because your business failed or because you're worried about dying in pain of cancer, you have committed suicide. And they don't want to use the term suicide because they're trying to lull people into thinking it's something else. And they're also trying to normalize the practice and try to make it a part of a normal part of healthcare. And I would point out that the Hippocratic Oath, which very few doctors take anymore, unfortunately, has a specific proscription against assisted suicide in that oath, and that's 2,500 years old. And for people who say, well, only religious people are against assisted suicide, Hippocrates wasn't a Christian. It's 500 years before Christ. Hippocrates was a Greek, ancient Greek person who believed in the gods and all of that stuff. So, but he was a physician who understood that to promote the equal dignity of your patient, you do not end their lives. And he also said in that oath, which is really remarkable, that a doctor had the duty to treat a slave in the same way he treated a master, because a doctor's job is to treat every human being as an inherent equal. And that is something I think that is very important, and I think assisted suicide actually violates human rights in that sense, because you're saying to some people, yes, your suicide is worth preventing, but you're saying to others, but yours isn't. And that creates a two-tiered system of valuing lives. And I have to correct what Dr. Bohr said in terms about Germany. Germany recently I think it was earlier this year, it might have been late last year, but I think it was this year, actually created a constitutional right to suicide for anybody for any purpose. You don't have to be sick. You don't have to be disabled. You don't have to have any irremediable suffering. You don't, even if your suffering can be palliated, which is also true in Canada, for example, but you don't want that, you have a right in Germany to suicide, and there's also a constitutional right in this court case to assist in suicide. But that's the logic. The argument we should be having isn't whether somebody who's terminally ill should be able to have assisted suicide, or whether somebody who's got a profound disability, a serious disability, should be able to have assisted suicide. But what is our society's obligation towards people who wish to commit suicide? I submit that it should be suicide prevention in every case. That's how you promote equality. That's how you value people, as opposed to suicide prevention in some cases, but not in others, because you're basically saying when you do that, some suicides are right, and people get that message.
Thank you very much, Wesley. I have a final question. This is a question on behalf of UK parliamentarians. The question as to whether euthanasia and indeed assisted suicide should be legalised was rejected by the UK Parliament in 2015.
Yep.
Bearing in mind the developments and experience of the past few years in other jurisdictions, which both you and Professor Bohr have described, and the fact that at some point in the UK Parliament this issue may well arise again, what advice would you give to members of Parliament in the UK when at some point they're likely to have to reconsider this issue?
Well, I think they don't need to re-engineer the wheel, if you will. I remember when the Joffrey report was done, they went to, just for example, went to Oregon and taught me things I wasn't aware of. In Oregon, assisted suicide is all self-reported by the doctors. There is no actual requirement for oversight by the state. It's all after the fact. And then we found out, thanks to the Joffrey report, which we didn't know, that they actually destroy all the data that they use to create their, I consider propaganda reports. So there's really no independent way to look at it. I think that another issue needs to be looked at when a member of the House of Lords starts to rumble about going with this, or the Parliament, the House of Commons. The cost, the money factor is really significant here. Derek Humphrey, who started the Hemlock Society, wrote a book called Permission to Die, in which he said saving money for the healthcare system is the great unmade argument in behalf of euthanasia and assisted suicide. Some of the Canadian descriptions talk about saving tens of millions of dollars, even more than that per year. And think about that, what could happen with the NHS under strain, which we all know it is. Of course, in my country, our health care system is under great strain as well. That it may take $100,000 or 100,000 pounds to give somebody the kind of interventions that are needed so that the patient doesn't want to commit suicide, but maybe 1,000 pounds to facilitate that death. Once you accept a suicide as a medical issue, once you, in terms of facilitating it, once you begin to look at the idea that the people who would tend to want assisted suicide may be the most expensive for whom to care, and once you start to add in the idea that people are worried about burdening their families, burdening their society, and if you add in the organ donation issue, you can begin to see where people would start to think, you know, I love my country, my duty is to die. And assisted suicide can lead to a duty to die. And by the way, the issue of the duty to die is often discussed in bioethics today. Some people say that the elderly have a duty to die. That proposed law in Canada, in the Netherlands, saying that if you're over 75 and you've got a completed life, that you should have access to euthanasia. That's really frightening. That's an abandonment of the elderly. That's telling the elderly that they don't matter as much. And we've had that problem in terms of COVID, for example, in New York, where our COVID positive patients are actually forced to go into nursing homes because the governor of New York apparently wanted to maintain enough space for younger people in the hospitals. And then thousands of people died because infected people were put into nursing homes. And I submit that's because we're in danger of casting aside our elderly people and thinking of them as no longer having a great value. And there's a utilitarian issue here that I think we should address. But I would think about the money issue in terms of fighting assisted suicide, as well as everything else. What kind of palliative care is available? Are the hospices under strain? Would this spread to people, because terminally ill people are just the tip of the iceberg. What about people with profound disabilities? Would they get that same message? And I think you could fight it back. And I've also noticed, for example, in the Royal Academy and in the British Medical Association, when the leadership of those groups tried to push these organizations into supporting assisted suicide or becoming neutral, you found great pushback from the members, the rank and file members of those organizations. So don't think that, keep the issue and keep up on the issue first and foremost. And whenever anyone stands up and says, oh, it's just for the terminally ill, challenge them at every point so that they can't ingrain in people's minds the idea that this is somehow compassionate, even though that's how it's intended sometimes. It's actually abandonment.
Thank you so much, Wesley. I did say that was my final question, but I do have another comment which you may briefly want to respond to, very briefly, on screen. And this is from a fellow member of Parliament from Scotland. It's Dr. Philippa Whitford. She has a medical background and she makes a very pertinent comment. She also made one of the most powerful speeches in our 2015 debate, and I encourage anyone listening to this webinar to have a look at Hansard and look at Dr. Whitford's speech in that debate. And she's commenting now, we thought after winning the vote in 2015 that it would not return so quickly, but it is already building up again. I worry most about the growing increase in a sense of a duty to die that could develop until it is the routine.
Yes, and I think I mentioned that I was very privileged. I've toured the UK at least 3 times on speaking engagements against assisted suicide. Twice I had the great honor of debating in the Scottish Parliament, which is quite an amazing building. I've been able to make presentations 3 times in the UK Parliament. I debated Dr. MacDonald, the late Dr. MacDonald, in Edinburgh, and that was quite a packed event. And the duty to die is a real danger, because the message being sent is that some of us are burdens on others of us, and that our best bet, if we really love our families, if we really care about our society, if we're really patriotic, we will not burden others. And that is a dehumanization that must be avoided at all costs. So I thank the doctor for her comment.
Just in closing, thank you again, and also Professor Bohr. As we've heard so eloquently and expertly from you both, this is a complex issue which merits careful consideration. And you've highlighted that what might be initially appealing arguments can have deeply concerning implications. And so it's right that we continue to be vigilant, to learn from the experiences of other jurisdictions over the past few years, and to continue to provide a compassionate response to the pro-assisted suicide lobby, whilst at the same time warning against the many incremental dangers of legalizing assisted suicide in this country that you and Professor Bohr have spoken so clearly about this evening. Can I quote Lord Alton again? He says this: if we lose hope in care and compassion, we lose everything. Care and kill can never be used as synonyms.